Trust. It's a funny concept when you think about it. Logically, it doesn't really make any sense to trust anyone or anything. From a purely evolutionary standpoint, you think that the trusting, or what we might sometimes call the gullible, would have been eliminated from the gene pool a long time ago. But trust was a necessary feature to unlock the killer app that helped create everything you see around us. And that killer app, of course, is cooperation. Because without these two simple ideas, you can't build a system of trade, laws don't make any sense. Pretty much everything's down to trust and cooperation. Now, trust comes in many shapes and forms, but to get speed and scale, to get the things we enjoy today, trust is often established digitally through things like signatures, voices, vision, and interactions. So what happens to business when trust is eroded? Hey there, and welcome to the AI Forecast. I'm your host, Paul Muller. Join me along with leading companies and industry experts as we explore the past, the present, and the future of data and AI in the enterprise every week. Now, if you haven't already, we'd love it if you could take a couple of minutes out to leave a 5-star review. We really do appreciate all the support you give us. And speaking of support, a huge thank you, of course, to the show sponsor Cloudera for bringing this podcast to life. So to help address the topic of trust in a post-truth digital fake world, I'm joined by, or at least I hope I'm joined by, Jim Brennan, the Chief Product and Technical Officer at GetReal Security, where he leads innovation in AI-powered digital authenticity. Welcome to the podcast, the person who claims to be Jim.
Thank you, Paul. Pleasure to be here.
It's great to have you here. Hey, before we get into the topic of trust in a digital world, we do a little thing to warm up we call the lightning round or the fast four. Are you ready to join in?
I'm ready. Let's go.
Let's do this. What would people, Jim, who know you best, say is your superpower?
Well, part of me wants to say you should ask those people, Paul, but if I had to guess, and actually what I would like to think is that they would say that I'm somebody who can see the big picture when it comes to a problem, set a vision, but then more importantly, actually operationalize to get to a solution.
Sounds like you've got the perfect job.
I think so. Yeah, I hope so.
All right, next up. This is an interesting one to ask a technologist. The most impactful technology of all time.
I'm going to go pretty old school and maybe pretty traditional in saying the printing press. But the reason I'm going to say that is because, as I'm sure you would agree, in a lot of ways, it was a huge step in making knowledge available to everybody. Whereas before it was very much contained to the elite who could afford books and so forth. So that dissemination of knowledge and empowering everybody to benefit from it, I think in many ways really changed the course of history beyond even what many people think of when they think of the printing press.
It was the hipster internet, really, wasn't it?
Well, exactly. I mean, you could say in a lot of ways it set the ground for that, and we talk about democratization of information and all the things that go into social networking, but it really began with that in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I'll pay that. I wholeheartedly agree.
Yeah.
We always talk about AI in the media. Certainly you read about AI automating this and automating that and what it's going to do for businesses and so forth. But the personal angle's often missed. What would you like to see? What would Jim like to see AI automate for Jim in his future?
If I'm being really honest, Paul, I would love for it to automate cleaning of my kitchen every night. Although I probably don't need AI for that. But that's kind of me being funny, trying to be funny. Maybe not.
No, it is. No, don't be funny. Honestly, it is one of the most popular answers on this show.
Is that right?
Is cleaning and meal preparation. So if any product managers are listening, you've got a willing audience of 7 billion people out there.
I like it. I like the meal preparation part. It's the cleanup that I could use some help with. So maybe we're onto something if that many people who have come on this show have said that. So we'll look into it.
I love it. All right. And last but not least, we all have our little tips, tricks, hacks we use when we work with data every day. What are some of the best practices or tips or tricks that you've learned as someone who works with data?
Yeah, it's kind of the basics, really. Version control. Understanding understanding what data is what and keeping track of it, attribution of data sources. It's the stuff that's not maybe the most interesting or exciting, but really it's the stuff that comes back to bite you if you haven't taken care of it from the get-go.
And as really the topic of today's show is, of course, is provenance, chain of custody.
Sure. Absolutely.
What am I actually looking at? Where did it come from? Hey, before we get into the topic of trust and security in the AI world, do you want to talk us through your background a bit? Because you've got an interesting career history.
The short story is about 25 years in cybersecurity. And within cybersecurity, because that's a pretty big field, my focus was in large part on network endpoint security, threat management, security operations, and worked in a variety of companies that specialized in that, going way back to the beginning of that period to a company, ISS, Internet Security Systems, which was really one of the old guard that eventually got acquired by IBM. But later on the services side with SecureWorks, now part of Dell, before part of Sophos, eventually went back to IBM to help build that business, which included the QRadar SIM product, the Resilient SOAR platform. So again, a lot of that threat management angle. And I will say I just sort of fell into cybersecurity all those years ago, Paul. I can't say that it was a grand plan because it wasn't really a thing back then in a lot of ways. But I found myself in a space that I found to be incredibly interesting, and I had a pretty good feeling that it was going to be never ending. And so that in terms of the evolving threats and the need for it, and that's definitely played out to be the case.
I remember, I don't know if you know who Professor Gene Spafford is.
I don't know that name.
Okay, so Spaff was one of the original lecturers, one of the original academics in the world of cybersecurity, and I'm talking now 35, 40 years ago.
Okay.
I remember going to a Unix conference back when I was a teenager. I was that nerdy. And Spaff gave a lecture in Australia. He flew out here to do a lecture. And I remember at that point in time, what I think a lot of cybersecurity people, I imagine, felt, certainly for me, is the idea of, because he was obviously taking a defensive posture, but in order to describe the defensive posture, you need to describe the adversarial posture. And it just felt thrilling and intellectually challenging because, of course, you're trying to imagine what someone else might do. There's all of the craft involved in it. And it really is an addictive industry, isn't it?
Absolutely. And of course, that craft evolves at the same time as our evolution on the security vendor side. And so that's when I talk about never ending, cat and mouse, whatever you want to call it, right? That I think that same interest that you saw, or the thing that you found to be compelling, continues and probably is more so now because things have gotten more complex, right?
Yeah. So serious question.
Yeah.
I'm assuming maybe my question is slightly different. Is it a ridiculous question to ask? How do I know it's really you in this modern AI age?
Not at all. It's a completely valid question to ask. And, we happen to be recording on a platform for a podcast. If we were on a typical Zoom call, I could very quickly bring up a deep fake, a swap face, as we call it, on myself and actually clone my voice. And I'm pretty sure you would be able to tell the difference had you never met me before or looked at my LinkedIn picture. These technologies exist today, and I'm sure we'll get into this. In the last 3 months, they've gotten more accessible, better, cheaper. And I'll be really candid with you. Before I got involved in this space, I was not aware of this. I mentioned my background is more, kind of overall network endpoint. And frankly, one of the reasons why I found this company that I'm with to be so compelling and this mission to be so compelling is because it's certainly cyber security, but it's very different. It's very different. These attacks are coming in sort of over the top, on top of all the 35 years of network infrastructure security that we've put into place. Now all that matters is this window that you're looking at on your screen and the voice that's coming across. And all of that is completely vulnerable now. And so we'll get into that more. But yeah, the short answer to your question is you've got to take my word for it at this point in time. Plus, you sent me the link via emails to get into the platform. So
yeah, but I suppose if an adversary had, for example, breached your defenses, gotten control of your email, had just sat there rather than doing anything with that exploit, had sat there lurking.
Yep.
they could conceivably have gone, all right, hey, I can see Jim's just about to have a really important meeting. Let's not use this exploit. Let's not try and steal his data right now, because if I can get to the meeting with the CEO of the company he works for, I can find out some information about some M&A that's coming up, and I can make a ton of money on the stock market, or I could do anything with that sort of information. So that's, I suppose that's the risk, isn't it? Is that this really amplifies what I guess what a term of art in the world of cybersecurity would be called social engineering.
Absolutely.
It mechanizes it in some respects, doesn't it?
It does, and the way you were thinking about it, Paul, is exactly right. This threat is not typically going to be one that appears by itself. It's part of an attack chain, just like all more sophisticated attacks. There is some initial compromise, whether it's my email credentials to get to that link that you sent me, or some other aspect of even social engineering. But this is what we're talking about here, is ultimately playing out as a new component of a pretty familiar tool set. And just to make a finer point on what we were saying before about the kind of implications of this, I was talking to a CIO not long ago, and the way that they articulated it really resonated with me, because we were on a Zoom call having a very similar conversation. And this particular CIO, he leaned in very close to his camera, and he sort of drew an outline. He said, this window right here, I get all of the information on which I run my business through this window. And now I can't trust anything that's coming through that window. And it's a profound thing, right? We've had decades of digital transformation that has brought us all this wonderful ability to collaborate and communicate. But now the very thing that has served us so well and become this fabric is the new attack surface. And as I mentioned, it's sort of over the top. We think of it as over the top. You've got your typical OSI layered stack model. This is, call it the display layer, the interaction layer, right?
Layer 8, the human layer.
It's layer 8. It's layer 8. It's the human layer. But now you can't, how do you even know that person is human, as a matter of fact? Not to mention, is Paul really Paul, right? Because authentication is the other piece of this, besides whether or not I'm looking at a synthetic recreation or an actual human being. It's all part of the same problem.
I mean, there's so many questions about this, and as you probably could tell by my opening, I think about this problem a lot, about what does trust mean in this environment, because trust, as I said in the opening, and cooperation go hand in hand, and you don't get much done without cooperation, and cooperation doesn't work without trust. And if you can't trust what you see digitally, to your point, then you have to go back to really expensive in terms of time, expensive in terms of actual, capital required, logistically expensive, physical mechanisms, which themselves are not entirely invulnerable. But you can imagine people going, well, if I can't trust what I see through that little window, I'm going to need to fly to you, and I've just lost 2.5 days as I go and make that trip, right?
Absolutely.
The question I'm trying to get to here is, I'm taking a pretty dramatic view of it, obviously, but do we run the risk that this problem sounds so, I'm going to make a film reference here, so Minority Report, so futuristic and so improbable that it defies credibility at board level? People are like, oh, that'll never happen to us. How is it being perceived at a board level?
It's a really good and important question. Let me answer two parts. One, on one hand, and as you just saw, or as we talked about, you didn't see it in real life, but this technology exists today. And typically it only takes a person seeing it one time and you're a believer, you get it. And I remember the first time I saw it, somebody was using a tool called deepfakes Live, and they did this with a wave of the hand, and all of a sudden they were Keanu Reeves and they were talking to me, and it was actually quite shocking, because I had no idea the tech had gotten that good. So that's the first thing, is that it just takes one time to see it, and then you believe, okay, it can happen. But then the next sort of cognitive link that needs to happen for most people is, what are the implications for business? And what does it mean for me? And that's sort of where we are right now, in terms of where the market is right now. For a lot of people, there's been enough in the press and things written about it, and podcasts and YouTube videos for people to know, okay, it's a thing, but is it really a thing for my business? And what you mentioned is actually a really important thing as far as how you communicate, because there are a lot of articles being written about the $25 million financial fraud case out of Hong Kong, and these very sensational types of things. And I do think that as a CISO talking to a board, you run the risk of, if you kind of attach to those big sensational stories, you run the risk of the board maybe not taking it seriously as something that is likely to happen to us. That's crazy. That'll never happen to us. That couldn't happen to us. And the reality is there are things happening every day on a much smaller scale that frankly are not being talked about as much in the wide open media. Things like fraudulent candidates. That actually is starting to come up more and more in terms of imposter hiring. The reality is that companies all around the world are hiring fraudulent candidates for all types of, driven by all types of purposes. In the least nefarious cases, perhaps it's a candidate that is trying to make some extra money from a sign-on bonus, and maybe they figure it's going to take a couple weeks before the employer finds out that they're not who they say they are. In the worst cases, you have nation-state actors that have coordinated campaigns to actually infiltrate Western companies for the purpose of espionage or financial fraud at scale. These things are happening. And so my advice, whenever I'm talking to a security leader on this topic of how do you actually communicate to the board, is to really focus in on those types of events and not necessarily run to the big, exciting article about the $25 million heist in Hong Kong. Because the smaller events, which are very impactful, of course, are happening. I can tell you, Paul, I talk to companies, Fortune 1000, Fortune 500 companies every single day. And every single one of them in the last 3 months has told us that they're having issues with fraudulent hiring. Just as one example, and there's other things happening.
I hadn't even stopped to consider that. You probably, people who are watching will have seen me holding my head. I'd not even stopped to consider that, but
sure,
that's terrifying.
It's terrifying, and it's happening, and it's happening at a pretty big scale, and it will continue to happen. And in that particular case, you think, most human resource teams are not set up to think, as you mentioned, adversarial thinking earlier, and thinking like the attacker. Most HR people, they haven't been trained to think like that, nor should they really have to, right? So going after that vector is turning out to be pretty fruitful for a lot of attackers, unfortunately.
As if I didn't already have to spend enough time in cybersecurity training each year learning about different ways we could be attacked, because we should be running regular cyber training. We should be running regular simulation exercises for things like phishing attacks, of course, and that's super important. I think most people, it passes the mum test, right? When your mum knows about spam and phishing, you kind of know that education's done its job. But now that I've got to go and call her up and say, hey, when I call you next time and ask for your bank details to help you out, don't give them to me.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Unbelievable. So we're going to need to we've got a whole raft of new training we need to roll out, I guess.
You're spot on. And that's it's not just about educating your board and bringing your board along, but educating your employees and making them at least aware of it, much like we've done for years with phishing and social engineering training. Is the case with those types of threats. You can't put all that responsibility on the end user. You train them. You do the best you can to make sure that they know how to spot these things, but in the end, it's not enough. It's not enough. You've got to have other layered defenses in place to account for this.
Yeah, okay. So let's talk about that, because, of course, I mentioned Gene Spafford at the beginning of it. He was, effectively became, his main claim to fame was for developing the basis of what we call firewall technology today, the idea of permissively letting certain forms of communication from certain sources in or out. So that was one of the original things. I guess antivirus probably even predates the internet. It goes back to the very early days of PC. So we've inevitably used technology solutions to fight technology vulnerabilities. Is there something that technology can do about this?
There absolutely is. And not only is there, but that is a requirement. So, and we touched upon this a little bit, the human eye is not trained to detect the level of sophistication that we're seeing in these deepfake image, video, audio clips, human eye and ear, right? Our systems were not built for that. And as we know, the tools that create these deepfakes will continue to get better. And in fact, we've done all types of perception studies, and typically most humans, when it comes to analyzing a video or an image, it's basically at chance, 50-50. You're going to get it right. That's just the reality of it. And again, that's probably going to go down as the tools get better. So it's going to require technology. It does require technology to actually combat this threat. There are a variety of ways to do that. Here at GetReal, we've got a very strong opinion and belief that the right way to tackle this problem from a technology standpoint is not simply by using AI to combat AI. And what I mean by that, and to be clear, we certainly use AI like everybody else, right? But you can't simply train your way out of this problem. You can't simply stand up and train sort of a black box ML model and feed it a bunch of real and fake and hope that it latches on to the right artifacts to make that determination. That's not enough. And so our approach, our belief, and we were co-founded by Dr. Hani Farid out of UC Berkeley, one of the preeminent leaders of digital forensics and computer vision from the last 25 years. He and his team, our research team, bring with them a wealth of digital forensic expertise, some of the best in the world, if not the best. And this is a team that can actually understand the underlying artifacts, the telltale traces that these different AI generation tools leave behind, because they do leave behind artifacts, whether it's facial warping or facial shifting in the context of a real-time call or noise patterns or what have you. They get to that level of detail, essentially reverse engineering the AI generation tools to understand what's left behind and what's underneath the covers, so to speak. And then we will use machine learning to basically instrument and go find at scale those artifacts and those telltale traces. And that's a very different approach. It's a very difficult way to go about it in terms of it requires a ton of expertise and knowledge, but it is, we believe, the only way to actually mitigate the threats that we're seeing.
Just as a side note to that, are there any basic kind of hygiene things you can do to supplement that from a training standpoint? So, for example, get someone to stand up, turn around. I mean, are there things that you could ask someone to do today that maybe the AI tools haven't quite caught up with? Are there little hacks you could use to try and, if you need to try and test whether or not you're talking to a real human, or are the adversaries well in advance of anything that a human could ask for someone else to prove on?
Well, if you're talking about in the context of a human-to-human interaction,
yep,
being able to look for those telltale traces, at this point, we're pretty much through the uncanny valley, as Hani Farid likes to talk about. There was a time, as I'm sure you know, not too long ago, a couple of years ago, where most AI images of people had 6 fingers, or something was wrong. They couldn't get the hands just right. Lighting was a problem in terms of sort of correctly replicating real world lighting scenarios coming from the sun or a different lighting source. These things over time have gotten better and better, and they will continue to do so. So that's why I say you need technology to solve this, to actually determine real from fake. That will continue to be the case, even more so. And, for us, even with our approach we talked about, it's to a certain extent cat and mouse, right? Eventually the generators may actually figure out what we're latching onto, but then we're always looking for the next thing. And the tools themselves are, look, these generators are software tools, right? And so they have all the same issues in terms of version control and backporting of code and branch code and everything else. There are things that we can determine that actually will be present for many iterations of that code. But then in some cases, they will move on. They'll change the techniques they use. They'll change the functions they're calling within the software. But our mission is to always be on that forefront and always be looking for that next set of artifacts and those telltale traces.
In terms of the impact to businesses, both practically speaking, and to the changing dynamic in the boardroom between the chief information security officers and the board, maybe just, I guess we'll wrap up a little bit with what we see the future looking like. So, number one, what are some steps that people can start taking today to try and get on top of this problem?
Well, the first one I think we touched upon a little bit earlier. So if I'm talking to a CISO or CIO, really it's about educating the board. Mm-hmm. We talked before about sort of what examples to bring. The other important aspect of that, Paul, is to use sort of frameworks and terminology that the board is familiar with. And you yourself, you talked about social engineering, and in some respects, not in all respects, but in some respects, this threat of deepfakes and imposter attacks is a form of social engineering. or a form of phishing. And so, one of the challenges that any CISO has when trying to get funding for a new threat like this is to find that line item in the budget. And so by sort of reframing some of those existing known entities, things that do have line items in the budget already, and using that as a framework to talk to your board about it, you've got a higher likelihood of success of getting support to go solve the problem. So that's this counsel that I give to a lot of folks. The other piece of it we did touch upon as well is employee awareness training. It's not going to be completely sufficient, but it's necessary. So, and there are steps you can take. We can certainly help with that, but there are, things you can put in front of employees, webinars and so forth, just to at least educate them to this possibility. We talked before about seeing is believing. Just having your employees see what's possible with a deep fake and let them know that this technology exists. That type of awareness is important, so that maybe the next time they get on a call and the video is a little spotty and that person looks a little bit different than normal, maybe they'll at least stop and pause and think about it and maybe be a little careful about how they proceed, right? Those are the initial steps. And then beyond that, there is technology. So GetReal Security, we've got technology to help with this product. It is a real-time solution. We're able to basically join a Zoom call, a Teams call, a WebEx call, extract audio, video per participant, analyze that through a rich set of analytics and technologies, and then not only alert you as a participant in a call that something is amiss, but more importantly, we can plug into your enterprise security infrastructure and notify the security analyst team and the SOC and give them the tools they need to investigate. So that's really where this is going. Again, it's going to take technology to solve the problem. And we see this as a cybersecurity problem. This is not an AI problem. We are big proponents of AI, just like everybody else. This is a cybersecurity problem. And so the tools necessary to deal with it as such have to be in place.
And just, I've got to ask at a practical level.
Sure.
At the moment, in security, cybersecurity, there tends to be two kind of primary modes of deployment: a central deployment that kind of protects everyone. You install a firewall, everyone gets the benefit. And then there's endpoint where you have to put something on someone's device. What's the most effective way for protecting from this threat? Is it central or endpoint?
The beautiful thing is we're living in the age of cloud-based collaboration platforms that all expose APIs, right? And so the best way to get access to the audio and video to analyze is to make use of the APIs coming from those platform providers. Mm-hmm. And so it's not anything that has to run at the endpoint. You don't need to set up your own, infrastructure. A platform like us, we are tapping directly into those APIs. We're fully authenticated to do so. And we're handling all that traffic. Basically, think of it as a fork of the traffic. So we're not injecting any latency in the experience of the participants in that communication.
Awesome. So this doesn't need to be a huge project where you've got to go and install something on everyone's PC as well, which is good to know.
No.
That's awesome.
The biggest thing, whether it's us or anybody else, is, we talked about how this is a new thing for everybody to be aware of. And the other aspect is employees are going to have to get more comfortable with the fact that their communications are going to be analyzed in some respect for these types of security threats. And so privacy has to be taken extremely seriously, and data protection and all those things, and different deployment options for an enterprise to have so that they can fully control their data. That's a big part of this as well. But we live in an age, as we've talked about, where these threats are coming in over the top. You can't trust anything in this window, in this screen. And so new policies for organizations are called for, and new ways of operating are really called for as well.
We've obviously talked a lot about the enterprise, as we should. I'm just curious, problems that were distinctly enterprise problems with cybersecurity have become problems that we face at home every day. Do you see this being a mechanism of exploit at a personal level, or does the expense not justify the return?
So it already is, unfortunately.
Are you kidding me?
No, absolutely. You mentioned, I think it was your grandmother in your example, but there have been cases, usually involving high net worth individuals or celebrities, where they've received phone calls. Voice on the other end sounds identical to one of their children's voices, and that child is in distress and demanding ransom for their captives. I mean, really horrible stuff, right? I talk about it with my own children. You know, we actually we have a phrase established, and they all roll their eyes at me because they're teenagers like that. We don't need to do this, but there's a phrase, you know, where hey, if you get a phone call from me and you're not, and I'm telling you to do something out of the ordinary, and just ask me for the phrase. And I think unfortunately this is the world we're living in. You know, you can't. You talked about trust up front. There is no trust in your basic audio video signals anymore, which is a pretty profound thing, right? So we have to take precautions. And the unfortunate reality is this is definitely creeping into the personal side. In fact, it really kind of began there, right? It's been more recently that it's crept into the enterprise with some of the attack types that we talked about here. So so you just have to be mindful of that. And ultimately the solution for that type of scenario, you're talking like, carrier grade integration where your major carriers have technology built in to detect this type of thing. We're probably a good ways away from that. As you know, that takes years for those types of deployments to take hold, but that's likely where this is headed.
Right. Well, again, another good case for education, which, with cybersecurity seems to be so often the theme. And it's not to denigrate it or dismiss it at all. It's super important. Basic hygiene, make sure people understand the threat.
Absolutely.
Jim, I can't thank you enough for joining us. I kind of wish we hadn't had this conversation because you've given me chills in a way that I wasn't quite expecting, but that's what happens when you talk to cybersecurity folks, unfortunately. You become that little bit more paranoid. Hey, if people are interested in learning more about the topic, where can they go?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having me. And I share your sentiment in general, and I live and breathe and think about this stuff every day. So thanks for having me on. I'm happy to come back. So would love to have your audience learn more. If you go to GetRealSecurity.com, you'll find a wealth of information and a lot of great thought leadership, educational content as well that you can make available to other folks in your organization as well. So I would start there, and we'd love to help out anybody who's got an interest in learning more.
Jim, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Paul. Really enjoyed it.
Brilliant. Well, that's a wrap, everyone. Big question. Do we need to revert to the physical in order to maintain trust in the digital? Love to know your thoughts. Drop them into the comments section below or hit us up. You can hit up Cloudera on LinkedIn using the handle @Cloudera with your thoughts. We'd love to hear what you have to say about it. As always, we've got a humongous array of guests coming up. So if you have enjoyed today's episode or the show in general, make sure to like, share, and subscribe so you and your friends don't miss a drop. Thanks again to Cloudera for hosting another episode of the AI Forecast. And thank you all for listening in. We'll see you all, or at least you'll see someone who looks and sounds exactly like me, but might possibly not be me next week.